change this year where we're trying to publish all of these on YouTube and make them publicly available. Before, they would only be privately available. So we would have to send you a link and you could view them that way. But now we're trying to be a little bit more open source, just share all of these meetings and the interesting research that everyone presents over here and the discussions that we have and make them publicly available. So you can tell me now or via email later if you prefer not to do that and if you prefer to keep the meeting private. But by default, we would be making them public. But we're working on the website for that as well. So I'll share the link with you anyway beforehand, but just for future purposes, they will be shared on a website that everyone can access. Okay. And then the next thing that I would like to remind everyone is just the structure of this meeting. So there will be around 40 minutes of a presentation by Brynn, and then 30 minutes of a Q&A with all of the attendees. And then we will, the final section will be 30 minutes of a summary, around 30 minutes of a summary, and some feedback by Carl and a discussion between the two of you or with everybody else as well. We would just like to encourage attendees to turn on their camera if they can, just to foster more of an active environment, I guess. And also to remind everyone that there will be a Q&A session. So just keep some questions in mind and prepare them, write them down, so then you can ask them when the time comes. And that's it from me for the introduction, but I'll hand it over to you, Brynn, for introducing yourself and the work that you'll be presenting today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be here on this, the first day of, or the first meeting of 2025. Yeah, I'd like to thank Mao for inviting me to present this work that that I presented in Delft with her in September. And just yeah, a little bit of introduction for myself is that I'm currently a PhD student at Concordia University in Montreal. I'm in the process of writing my dissertation there. I'm in both the philosophy and the mathematics departments, and kind of a bit of a strange interdisciplinary PhD. This work is a part of my dissertation. It's something that it has a very kind of strange methodology, but I'm looking forward to some feedback on that from this group, which seems also very interdisciplinary. So I come from a fine arts background. My background is in fine arts. So my approach to these things, both philosophy and mathematics, is often influenced by that, by the sort of creative research approach. So I've been looking at specifically structures of graphical probabilistic modeling and their instantiations in artificial intelligence as kind of like specifically the mathematics more so than the programming, but specifically as a sort of apparatus or tool, something that has specific tendencies that like almost like an art object in itself, that there's some things that it affords and there's some structures that that kind of narrow those affordances in certain ways. So the project that I'm presenting today is going to be a chapter of the dissertation research. It draws on phenomenological lineages from Husserl to Merleau-Ponty to Simondon, as well as some basics from graphical probabilistic modeling. And it's also heavily influenced by the work which brought me to return to academia, which has been, again, creative arts work specifically in contemporary dance and movement arts. My introduction to these was actually to build a neural network, a language model, not a large language model, a smaller language model that was based off of 4 years of choreographic scoring that produced new scores for specific work. And this relationship to movement has influenced the way in which I've been thinking about these models, specifically in relation to what cognition is, how it relates to the body, and how that relates to like movement in general. So with that in mind, I guess I'd like to start with just talking about movement from the point of view of Husserl. Husserl begins with experience and the certainty of being, in which all objects are simply given. So there's a, sorry, I'm gonna have to do some screen moving here to show some quotations. So before every movement of cognition, the object of cognition is already present as a dynamis, which is to turn into an entelikeia. This preliminary presence means that the object affects us as entering into the background of our field of consciousness, or even that is already in the foreground, possibly already grasped, but only afterward awakens the interest in cognition, that interest which is distinguished from all other interests of practical life. This is from Experience and Judgment. Husserl often describes this activity of cognition as a movement, sometimes as a turning toward. He describes it as a continuous movement that, quote, specifies and confirms, goes beyond what is at any given time grasped in singularity and relative determinateness and accepted as such, end quote. This movement is what gives us the qualitative discontinuities or contrasts that allow an object to stand out from its background. He also makes an analogy of this physical sensuous apprehension of data with that of the non-sensuous data. Here, the discontinuities are not as present and cannot be relied upon to give an account of the grasping of thought or desire as an object. However, the insistence on the necessity of movement of cognition is still present. In the domain of non-sensuous data, there is, to be sure, no question of qualitative discontinuities of this kind. Still, there is something analogous here also. Among the different obscure movements of thought which stir us, one thought, for example, stands out from all the rest and has a sensitive effect on the ego, as it, so to speak, forces itself against the ego. He terms the physical apprehension, the moving towards or around the object, often mostly involuntary, as kinesthesis. The qualities of this movement are both receptive and productive. These types of movements are qualified as an I perceive, which includes a turning towards itself of the ego, in that it sets up a possessive relation. This then proceeds to an I can, which implies a movement towards or around the object and its open and undetermined horizon. So in Husserl, we have at each stage of object apprehension a kind of movement. One of the continuous movement of consciousness, which is affected by the object at first, before turning attention towards it in a more conscious movement, which in its possessive qualities and a substantiation of the object and the subject and vice versa, also is a turn towards the ego. And then the kinesthesis, a movement which is more literal, a seeking out of data about the object, in which the body becomes implicit as something which claims ability or power. Merleau-Ponty expands and makes concrete this analysis of movement in Phenomenology of Perception, bringing the body and its particular abilities into the structure of perception. In the spatiality of one's own body and motricity, a chapter in Phenomenology of Perception, this movement of thought in perception, even at the involuntary level, is inextricably bound to the body, its abilities, and its movement, inhabiting space and time. Consciousness is being toward the thing through the intermediary of the body. A movement is learned when the body has understood it, that is, when it has incorporated it into its world. And to move one's body is to aim at the things through it, or to allow one's body to respond to their solicitation, which is exerted upon the body without any representation. Motricity is thus not, as it were, a servant of consciousness, transporting the body to the point of space that we imagine beforehand. For us to be able to move our body toward an object, the object must first exist for it. And hence our body must not belong to the region of the in itself. It must also belong to the world. From this analysis comes a more concrete notion of perception as an I can, which ties together world, body, ego, and consciousness. Merleau-Ponty founds the possibility of movement as the kernel of intentional perception, that consciousness can move in space and time as a necessary precondition of being able to apprehend objects from a background. And in turn, that perceptual ability affects existential and metaphysical analyses. Quoting Merleau-Ponty here again. Finally, these clarifications allow us to understand motricity unequivocally as original intentionality. Consciousness is originarily not an I think that, but rather an I can. Vision and movement are specific ways of relating to objects, and if a single function is expressed throughout all of these experiences, then it is the movement of existence, which does not suppress the radical diversity of contents, or it does not unite them by placing them all under the domination of an I think, but rather by orienting them toward the intersensory unity of a world. Movement is not a movement in thought, and bodily space is not a space that is conceived or represented. If, according to Husserl, movement is a necessary precondition of perception, and following that, if for Merleau-Ponty, the body and its motricity is also implicated in this necessary precondition of perception, according to a body schema, how are we to understand the perception of the machine? Can we look at the graphical model of a perceptual apparatus and see in it a body or a body schema? Or even more primordially, a unitary thematic grasp, which constantly enriches itself and which coincides with itself in its different parts. If we take these analyses of perception seriously, a slew of new questions arise. Is it possible to have a body schema without a body? Can these models themselves perceive, or is it something else which imitates a perception or simulates it? I'm not here particularly interested in addressing the question of a simulation of perception versus real perception. Those types of questions tend towards some kind of infinite regression. But if we assume that these perceptual apparatuses have a sense of a type of body schema, as theorized as a sense of a whole and world, and an embedded subject-object grasp, if we analogize these concepts from Husserl and Merleau-Ponty with the perceptual with the perceptual apparatus of the graphical model and its probabilities, what sense of movement could arise from this body schema? To do this, I think we have to look at the mechanics of the systems themselves and perform a sort of phenomenological analysis on their movements. One way to do this would be to look at the graphical representation of these models and track dependencies through directed and undirected edges. This would give you an analogy of a kind of movement in terms of which probabilities are carried over, how far along the graph they can be carried over, how far one node's probabilistic outcome saturates those around it, and what a particular piece of data's decay rate is over these graphs.
Oh, there you go.
This is often the basic work that modelization is. It's an attending to the body schema of the graph and making surgical cuts here and there to sever data connections from infecting other sections. This seems to me to be a form of design, and one of the ways in which researchers who use models like these may impose their own perception of causal relations, or in fact, a particular outcome framework upon the graph itself. In terms of some sort of unitary thematic grasp, a la Husserl, we can suppose that the body schema would be a network of nested functions, which represent probabilistic dependencies. The sense of the nested functions have a relationship to the whole connectedness of the network, its direction towards the perceptual object, and their own abilities and intra-sense, which come about through the relation of their function. Merleau-Ponty describes the body schema as a, quote, pre-logical unity. And in some analogical way, we can think of the networked models of these perceptual apparati as post-logical. There is a logic established just by virtue of the schema of connection and direction, but there is also a latency which begins to be filled as the data that determines their activity begins to interact with the results. However, I find this to be a poor account both of a pre-logical unity in the Husserlian sense, or a unitary thematic grasp, and a poor account of movement within these models as well. Its impoverishedness points towards a void of situated or embeddedness that is described by phenomenology as the instantiation of the subject-object relation and its participation in perception. Given my skepticism on the possibility of a graphical model having a body schema of its own and its function in perception, I would like to continue on in an as-if manner to look at what that might be in relation to this form of perception. In my view, the configuration of a model's directedness, its dependencies, and the cliques that are necessary to make inference in these models tractable are reasonable analogous structures to the idea of a schema, but they don't address the more originary conditions for perception, such as the different forms of movement that Husserl describes. The analysis of the mathematics that underlies image segmentation might give us something to more accurately account for what kind of movement is possible in these structures. I would like to take a closer look at how they move. The types of movement we can find in these mathematics are based in a few foundational structures, as most of you probably know. We can start with the most well-known Bayes' theorem. Bayes uses the commutative operations of multiplication and division, which are necessary to maintain proportionality, which is a crucial aspect of probability. Because of this, it can also very easily be mapped onto a geometric space. It is often necessary for probabilities to come in the form of distributions, which have an area and are often calculated by density functions, defined as a specified area of the distribution. Non-distributed or sampled probabilities can even more easily be mapped as proportional geometric areas because they don't need to account for curves. The iterative magic of Bayes occurs because of the commutativity of these operations, which allows you to substitute the prior with the posterior, leading to an updated result. Movement could be theorized here in this very simple equation as an expansion of the time series interval that this substitution allows for in iteration, something like a durational movement. If you look at this geometrically, the movement is one that curls in on itself with each iterative step in terms of the proportional probabilities towards a more precise probability distribution. This movement occurs through function space, a linear space which has as its domain all different probability distribution subsets. If we look specifically at image segmentation models, which deal with object recognition, there is a much more concrete movement that appears. This is because we have a spatial set of coordinates that correspond with an image, making the movement much more direct to our particular experience with the most basic type of this application, and there are many different methods. Differences are measured in RGB color space, which most of us are familiar with and is spatialized on clear coordinates. We have a set of sites S, where in each site, each small s in S has a ys in ys, which is conditionally defined on S. Each of these sets is defined by the capitalized variable, with the lowercase representing a particular instance of that set. You can think of S as a set of coordinates, pixels, and ys being the set of the data about that image. Here we are using color. It's a set of coordinates in RGB color space. There's also a set of XS, which is defined on S, which is the set of classes, or in colloquial terms, an interpretation of the color data. In this image example, we could set the set of classes to 2, which is ant or not ant. A bold X represents the vector of that class, which would be a 2-dimensional vector in this case. So here we have S as the coordinate system of pixels. Y is the data about that coordinate system, which is a location in RGB space. So we already have two spaces being set up here. X is the vector of interpretation of ant or not ant. And N is the set of neighbors for each individual interpretation, X. So the questions that this asks is it close? Is it close, especially the N set of neighbors, is it close in the color space to the Y? There's usually a defined threshold between neighbors. If yes, then ant. If no, then not ant. And this is the basic way of moving that this apparatus needs to be able to determine a figure from a ground. In order to gain information about the neighborhood of XS, you need another set, N, which is the set of neighbors for each XS. V is defined as the potential function between S and T, which is a part of the set of neighbors. You can then use a multi-level logistic model to add a value beta to the neighbors, as you can see here. Basically, if Y is within a threshold of the relevant color information for S, it gets assigned an ant, not ant value, and then N gets assigned an additional 1 or -1 beta value, which is added up over the entire set, making same or similar thresholded values have a much higher probability of being classified as ant or not ant and defining their edges. Because the set Y is a random conditional field, you can use a likelihood function to measure the probability that each observed Y will match a given X. This is often done by moving between Gibbs or normal distributions. Here, the probability of class of X not X, or ant not ant, and Gaussian distributions, which here is the color space data. Movement in this model appears concretely as minimal, stepwise, and highly microscopic. It's almost very ant-like in its choreography. However, there are different lines of movement that occur within the mappings between spaces that can make minimal moves much grander, such as when they traverse the large distances of color space and move from coordinates to classes. As an analogy with movement, it's as if a body is working on the floor in small gestures and pops up tall with the same small gestures as it leaps from the ground to the figure of the ant. As we can see from the likelihood function in the last example, another movement that occurs in these processes is between different distribution families.
I think he's frozen as well, right? Is it frozen for you too, Jerry? Okay. We'll just wait for a couple of minutes, see if she comes back in.
I think Brynn accidentally pushed the stop sharing. That was pushed the.
But not only stop sharing, I think she's now frozen
No, yes,
as well, so she might have left accidentally or something. I don't know. There we go.
Apologies for that. My computer restarted for some reason.
All good. I think we have two versions of you now for some reason.
Okay. Oh. Okay, everyone can hear me and see everything fine?
Yep.
Fantastic. I'm just going to go back a little bit here. Okay, so as we can see from the likelihood function in the last example, another movement that occurs in these processes is between different distribution families. Conjugate operations allow movement within a predefined space of distributions. For example, the commonly used space of all Gibbs distributions or normal distributions, a subset of all distributions or distribution family, the definition of which is having the same functional form, which I believe I have here, the general form of the Gaussian. For example, so within a family, they differ only in their parameters. So the movement occurs in the space of the set of all Gibbs distributions between parameters, and this movement is made possible and fueled by the Gaussian distribution, which is its conjugate. Gibbs and Gaussian distributions have different functional forms, but you can move within the space of the Gibbs family if your data is Gaussian, and this can be proven by linear algebra. And this is also because when you, this is what we mean when we call the Gibbs distribution a conjugate prior of the Gaussian, because it results in a Gibbs distribution. Your data, which is Gaussian, acts as a function on the Gibbs space. The Bayesian substitution of the posterior to the prior is a function that moves from one distribution of the Gibbs family to another distribution of the Gibbs family. Because the data is Gaussian, this updating function keeps the posterior within the same functional form or distribution family. There are different pairs between the distributions and the form of data, and these pairs are called conjugate when the data results in a posterior that stays within the same distribution, allowing for Bayesian updating. The Gibbs distribution parameters determine the probability of the class, for instance, a pixel being ant or not ant. This is an example of a parametric distribution. If you know the parameters of the Gibbs distribution and you know that it is in the functional form of Gibbs, then you can identify what specific Gibbs distribution it is, as they're always defined by their parameters. So the movement that occurs within this updating, which is structured by Bayes' theorem, is a movement within the set of all Gibbs distributions. To spatialize this movement, the definition of the Gibbs distribution is based on its parameters. The spatialization of the set of all Gibbs distributions would be dimensionally the same as the number of parameters per distribution. One parameter that would be a number line. One parameter would be a number line, one-dimensional, whereas two parameters per distribution would be two-dimensional and Cartesian. This movement across the space of all Gibbs distributions is part of how the parameters of the data are able to change and is essential to the updating process of the model. For example, a Bayesian updating without data is solely an identity function. It just defines itself. Or another word for that would be an automorphism. You move from one set of parameters, one specific Gibbs distribution, to another set of parameters, another specific Gibbs distribution, by way of updating the parameters based on the data, which comes in the form of the Gaussian distribution. The Gaussian and the Gibbs distributions are paired in that the Gibbs is the conjugate prior to the Gaussian. There is a certain amount of imposition of these structures on the data, because if you use the Gaussian data method on the Gibbs prior, it results in another Gibbs distribution, allowing the Bayesian update to occur smoothly. But it does require modeling data in specific ways. When you assume your data is Gaussian, it enables and necessitates using a Gibbs distribution. So there is a certain amount of the subjective body that creeps into the movement once again. Viewing the affordances of movement in these mathematical operations as either explaining or stimulating the movement moment of apprehension, of perception, appears to me as a weak analogy. However, by focusing on the definition of movement and how necessary it is to these mathematical models and to mathematical understanding of the world in general, we can potentially approach something similar to an exploration of invariances, as Husserl would describe it. If we view these apparatuses as a perceptual tool, much like a microscope or a set of glasses, rather than a model of perception of consciousness in its entirety, there is no need to account for the caesura of the body or to nest many complex layers of similar models in a hierarchical embedding to invoke it. The models have been developed through the understanding of invariances within their languages themselves via movement through and across mathematical spaces using commutativities and idempotentia. And through this have been able to subject objects of research to modes of transformation that lead to the production of knowledge. To assign a body schema to the graphical models themselves would be to deny the bodies that design them the possibility of making non-objective decisions in their design. On the graphic level, within the categorization of data, and especially when directedness of a model is at stake. One final thing to keep in mind when thinking about movement in these spaces is to notice when it is cut short. If you follow Bayesian logic, ontologically, all probabilities are conditional. Every probability can be modeled as a dependence or conditional relation. What is chosen to be non-conditional, to be a non-conditional given, involves a worldly assumption made from the existence of a real body in the world. All of these operations are facilitated by an exchange of unknowns, from one unknown object X to another, whether that is a parameter or an observation of data, which shifts the axes of analysis and allows for a certain openness to assumptions being made in their application. A part of the interdisciplinary methodology that I'm interested in practicing here involves being conscious of assumed disciplinary descriptive hierarchies, which are common in the discipline of both philosophy and mathematics, and then proceeding to experiment with their reversal, or shifting the direction of the frameworks when possible. The proposition that this project is working under is that the language of perception and consciousness from phenomenology can be used to analyze graphical probabilistic models, an inverse of an attempt to model consciousness and perception with the language of these models of inference. By traversing between disciplinary spaces, I hope to experiment with these specific movements, find the invariances that they dance around, and see what they can reveal about the objects of study. So some of the questions that have come up for me in this research are, how do we think about some of these types of movement in the context of Husserlian or Merleau-Ponty modes of perception? Is there a type of movement between mathematical spaces that can account for the apprehension of a singular thought or an individual desire that becomes a distinct figure through continuous means? Some of these might seem like trivial observations, but they do begin to map where and how movement can occur and how we can proceed from here to determine what is a figure and which is ground in these models. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can we please have everybody unmute and just give a round of applause? Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Brynn, for your presentation. I would now like to open the floor for any questions that anybody may have. Okay, I don't see any questions right now, so I'll ask mine first, if that's okay. So I noticed that you were talking about figure and background distinction as a model or as a use case for this model, and the connections that you're making between like philosophy and mathematics for that. One of the questions that I had is related to the RGB information that you were talking about, because it, to me, or to at least to my understanding of the human perceptual system, it's not only color that is used for object detection against the foreground and the background, but also things like depth perception and edge detection and feature detection, motion detection, for example. That I think you covered that briefly, but what would be your suggestion to incorporate all of these different types of data and how they would then converge towards a single object to be detected?
Right. I mean, that's an interesting question. I feel like I think it's one of the most difficult things about trying to transpose some of these human perceptual abilities onto something that is so machinic, is that it doesn't exist in a world in the same way that we do. And so one of the questions that I have about that is kind of what is the world for the perceptual model? Like, does it exist in a space in the same way that a body can? Because depth perception also requires being able to move. A lot of these things require movement of a body in space, and so the RGB space is like not really a human way of perceiving things. But it is a space in and of itself. And I think that is one of the open questions for me, is if, like, what is the body of this model? Can we say that it has a body? And if so, where does that body live? Like, what world is it in? And how does it move around that world? Because I think it's very different than the world that we inhabit, and I don't know that it fully has access to the world that we inhabit in certain ways. It has to be quite stratified and metrizable in a certain way. So I think the interesting thing for me would be then to be like, okay, so how then do we create a world that has movement in order to have, like, specifically depth perception, in order to have that perceptual ability kind of bumped up to a level where it would be the same as a human's perceptual ability. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I'm very curious about like kind of trying to notice what is going on in organisms' capacities for perception, and where that lack is, and how would it possibly be simulated in another world.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you for
as
the
a
question.
follow-up to that, or also I guess to help other attendees get on the same page, it's just to summarize your presentation, what would be the objective for the research, and what would be the objective also for this presentation? Like, is there any specific questions that you have that the larger group could help you with, especially in relation to active inference or any Bayesian inference models? And yeah, just that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think the direction of the research is to kind of proceed in an interdisciplinary way in order to be able to find maybe some what seem like naive assumptions in one discipline, when approached from another might lead to some sort of further precise definitions of certain invariances within these structures. I think I'm very curious about especially how like neurobiology plays into some of these roles. It's not a field of expertise of mine, and so I think that would be like a big question in terms of the group. I'm very curious about the ways in which perception is modeled in neurobiology. Especially within active inference. I mean, I have some knowledge of the models, but not necessarily their application in neuroscience. And yeah, the questions that I have for my research, I mean, other than the approach, which I think can be a bit weird in terms of its interdisciplinary nature, I'm largely looking at forms of recursive structures in these types of models, like feedback structures, and like where those, like what exactly the sort of form and function that they play within these structures, and how that relates to how we think about intelligence in general.
Yeah, yeah.
And I feel like that's probably
yeah.
something that this group deals with quite a bit. But
Yeah, definitely. I'll let Carl speak to that if there are no other questions, because he would articulate them the best. Yeah, does anyone else have any questions? If so, you can either unmute or raise your hands using the raise hand function on Microsoft Teams. Okay, I do not see any other questions. So,
really, before you invite
Carl?
me, before you invite me, I'd like to hear Professor Trimble comment upon whether the RGB space is out there or in the head.
Oh, Paul, how nice to hear you. Happy New Year to you and all the rest of it. I'm sitting here wondering, it is fascinating, of course, but the ideas that you put forward, I think I lectured on this a little bit before. The idea is that the movement and emotion are so closely linked to what we do. And without being repetitive, but you need to go back to Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who in one of his ideas was that every thought has an emotion. And Hewlings Jackson too, you may not know these names, but they're rather important. But Hewlings Jackson was very, very certain that movement was related really to the most important aspect of our actions. But coming back to philosophy, it was William James, I'll just quote him, the William James, everything we see suggests some kind of movement. And he actually used the term that it was ideomotor activity. So this link that you're putting together it's been clearly prescribed in people who are interested in philosophy, but also in neuroscience. So I'm really very interested. The paper that I just recently had published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies was about how reading novels moves you. And if you look at issues to do with reading words that have to do with movement in a text, how that actually alters what then happens next. You're not conscious of this because it's a continuous line of activity that goes on in the brain and isn't broken down. And I'm interested in music. And what does music do? Music pulls you forward to the next musical phrase that is coming and giving you that moment of, enjoyment with an affordance that is so important when you're listening to music. So I thought what you say is so wonderful, and it branches out into arts and why we are pulled forward by artistic enterprises. And so I'm fascinated. Carl, I'm not sure if that was the answer you might have wanted me to give, but the link between the philosophy was completely lost until Merleau-Ponty, of course, was very important, as were a number of other people. But if you go back to the 1920s and Bergson and people like that, what you've said is actually all been said, but you're just putting it in a much more refined way. And I'm just so fascinated by this lecture. And thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. I love the connection between movement and emotion, like the metaphor that we use to say that we are moved. I think is when we talk about reading a novel or listening to a piece of music, I think it's very apt. There's like a reason why we feel that movement in that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Simon Farmer?
Yeah, I was going to, Carl, were you asking that question because the red, green, blue is obviously linked to the cones, but it's not all about the cones. And of course, yellow is part of blue opponency. Yeah, there's no cone for yellow, is there? So where does yellow come from? That was a question to Carl, I think.
Yeah, I think we need Semi Zeki to answer that one.
Wonderful.
I'm trying to think about what are the neural codes that are aligned to the environmental codes. And, we know much more now about the neural codes within the brain, but not accurately. But we know a lot about the mathematical aspects of nature's codes. And so you mentioned mathematics, and I'm not very good at mathematics, but is there a link that can be brought together in terms of what nature's mathematical codes are and our structure of the brain relates to it? What is the link between the mathematical structure of the way our brain is put together and the mathematical structure of our Umgebung, our environment that we have to live in all the time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think I'm more, I'm also interested in sort of the opposite of that question, which is what is it about the structure of the world and our relationship to it that informs us to frame it in a specific mathematical way? That potentially there's a form of alternative mathematics that exists in a world where we relate, where the beings that kind of find these invariances relate to the world that they are in differently. And I think that's also something I'm interested in, is that there is this innate connection between sort of mathematical structures as we kind of define them in the world around us and the way in which we relate to that world. Both in like what we find, how we find it, and how that is structured. Not to say that it's like all arbitrary, but that the way in which we approach it becomes very necessary in terms of its relationship to how the world is structured for us or around us as well.
Right. We'll now give Carl ready. Turned on his camera. All right, Carl's ready. Let's go.
Well, yeah, I thought I'd better step in
Yeah.
here and try and bring these threads together. But before I do that, just to again congratulate you, Brynn, on a very thought-provoking presentation, addressing some fundamental issues which I think are very relevant right through philosophy to mathematics via neurology, neurobiology, and everything else en route. And it's interesting that Professor Trimble brought up ideomotor theory. In one sense, you could look at active inference, which is an application of the free energy principle, as a 21st century version of ideomotor theory. That does exactly what I think you want to do, which is to take this interdisciplinary approach and to make crisp and precise and mathematically accessible the narrative accounts that are inherent in either Jamesian accounts or Germanic accounts of ideomotor theory, or what could be now cast as active perception. The fact that we do not see, we look. There is no sight or perception without the active aspect of active vision, which is the looking. And certainly it's interesting that vision has provided the most enduring vehicle to ask these questions, right from the days of Helmholtz right through now to questions of internalized actions, such as the attention theory of premotor attention theory, where attention is like looking on the inside, moving one's eyes around, but on the inside, looking at one there or level of some hierarchical world model of the brain, looking at different parts of different lower models of the brain. But this big theme about the structure of the environment and the structure and the calculus, also the cause-effect structure of our brains that are doing the belief updating and the perceptual processing or perceptual synthesis. I think that's another fundamental issue, and I don't think it matters so much which way you approach it. I think just knowing that the answer lies in that relationship is the most important offering. And indeed, the free energy principle is all about that. It's trying to understand how some internal system that is demarcated or individuated from the environment in which it is embedded measures, observes, relates to, synchronizes, fits with the environment or the eco niche or the sensorium in which it is embedded. And as soon as one sort of posits that, you come across this notion of what it is to be individuated from your world, what separates me from what's out there. And whatever perspective you can take a statistical perspective, and you can induce things called Markov blankets, or you can take a systems theoretic approach and say, well, to define any system such as me, I need to know the inputs and the outputs. And as soon as you induce the notion of inputs and outputs, you've got basically, you come back to this notion of active sensing, because the inputs are the sensory inputs and the action, the outputs are the movements, the things that elicit movements and change your relationship to the world or change the way in which you are sampling that world. So I think these are really fundamental architectural issues. And your ambition, I think, is almost exactly shared with the ambition of the free energy principle, which is to try and find the mathematical principles that describe this kind of self-organization. And I slipped the self-organization in because as soon as you move to an inactive account, where movement read as acting upon the world to change the things that you sense, to change your inputs, as soon as you put that into play, you are now open to the world. You've now got a circular causality in terms of this sort of reciprocal exchange between the world and the possibly even the lived world and the measurement of that world, which is you and me, or the observation of that world, the active observation of the world. And as soon as you've got that sort of bidirectional coupling, you are now open to the world. You're still separated from the world via your inputs and outputs or via your Markov blanket, but you are now an open system. So from the point of view of a physicist, you're now talking about self-organization of open systems. So you can throw away all 20th century physics, which is all about closed systems and equilibria. And now we're talking about non-equilibrium self-organization, sometimes called or sometimes described in terms of the kind of self-organization that breaks detailed balance. That has a special kind of physics, that has a special kind of maths, which I suspect is the kind of maths that you're chasing, and certainly is exactly the maths that is that the free energy principle is chasing. One interesting, at some point during your presentation, you were talking about sort of the shortest moves or the most likely paths. And of course, one way of summarizing the free energy principle is just to say that it is a principle of least action, where the action is just the path integral. So it's all, you can reduce entirely the free energy principle, given a separation between the internal states of your brain and the external states of the environment in which your brain is immersed, as a principle of movement, in the sense it is a principle of least action, using, say, the path integral formulation. So I'm just putting these things out there just to lend substance, I think, to the inclusivity of this agenda. Beyond just being multidisciplinary, you're trying to understand how anything survives or exists in some meaningful way in the larger scheme of things, in the environment or in the world. What I'm going to do, what I'm generally called on to do at this stage, is in service of sort of Riddy's question: how can we help? One of the I think the most practical ways of helping is just to point you to key resources, ideas, or papers that would substantiate some of the conclusions from the philosophical analysis and narrative analysis that you will find in other parts of the literature which you may not have come across if you don't do neuroscience, for example. Then questions about where does yellow come from may not, although we find them terribly intriguing, you may not quite understand where they come from. Just put that into context. This RGB, this three-dimensional structure, this color space, is generally assumed to be a reflection of the fact that the inputs from the world to the brain are organized in such a way that you sample with 3 types of receptors, and that you wouldn't have that three-dimensional structure if you had 5 types of wavelength selected structures, or 1 if you just see in terms of how bright is something. The color wouldn't have any. It would be one-dimensional. So it's not out there. It's from the neuroscience perspective, it's very much in the way that we have disambiguated ourselves from the world on an evolutionary scale, and what evolution has endowed in terms of the sensory states or the inputs to the system that is apt for this particular kind of phenotype in this particular kind of world. But there are lots of other sort of, if you like, perspectives that Professor Trimble, for example, brought to the table, that Simon, Professor Farmer was alluding to. I'm, however, going to restrict my comments to a much more sort of prosaic mathematical set of papers that you might find interesting if you haven't already read them. I'm taking the view really of a physicist as opposed to a philosopher, and hopefully pick up on some things which you might find interesting or would lend substance to your arguments as examples of the same kinds of ideas emerging in other fields. You've covered an enormous number of topics, so the papers I was selecting and I should apologize, they're all very self-referential. They're work that we've done or my friends have done, and I apologize that they are somewhat disconnected, because there were things you said that oh yes, that's interesting, that resonates very much with this and that. Hopefully I'll be reminded why I picked out the papers when we go through them. But just to start, if I could share the screen. So my, let's do the share and see if this works. Share the screen, yep. Good, I'm hoping you can see my screen now.
Yep.
Because this has been recorded, I'm just going to flash through the papers that I'm referring to or other people have referred to, so that you can go back and then follow them up should you wish to. So this is the paper that Professor Trimble was talking about on the neural basis of our responses to reading novels on being moved, emotion in emotion. So that's what he was talking about in the, where was it? Yes, in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. So that came to was the first one. But what I wanted to show you was my favourite quote. So can I just ask, when was Husserl around? How old is it? In what century was he writing, and how old was he?
He was writing in the early 20th century and late 19th century.
Okay, but well, so about the same time that Hermann Helmholtz was writing then.
It was the contemporary, yeah.
So most of the work that I'm familiar with, and certainly upon which most of the physics backstory is predicated, inherits from the work of Hermann Helmholtz, who himself, I think, sort of, as I am told, I'm no expert on this, lifted or was certainly sympathetic sort of Kantian ideas. So this would be my movement quote. So each movement we make by which we alter the appearance of objects should be thought of as an experiment designed to test whether we've understood correctly the invariant relations of the phenomena before us, that is, their existence in definite spatial relations. And that seemed to be very much in the spirit of the quotes that you were talking about. Excuse me, especially if we want to mathematicalize this and talk about symmetries as opposed to invariant relations or equivariances and the like. But really, very, potent statement that sense making, perception is all depends very much in an inactive and embodied and situated way on the way that we sample and look at things and choose what to look at and the perspectives to take. So I thought if possible, you could sort of complement your philosophical. But I suppose that Helmholtz was a bit of a philosopher, but he obviously was more famous for his work in physics and in perception. So I felt that was nice to show. But let's go back to the papers. I've just put this one up here, just right at the end of your presentation, because you were talking about you are looking for certain mathematical structures that have a recursive aspect, and indeed you mentioned explicitly so recurrent. For example, recurrent connections in the brain that would inherit from a recursive application of the same kind of idea or same kind of movement or belief updating, read in a Bayesian sense. And it struck me that that was an important observation from many perspectives. So you can read, and well, I said that you can understand active inference as a 21st century version of ideomotor theory. There are other ways of understanding active inference. It could also be understood through the lens of cybernetics, and in particular, which again had this inactive situated aspect to it. And on that view, you would come across things like the law of requisite variety, the good regulator theorem. And if I just pick out the good regulator theorem, which states, and thought to be provably true, although that is disputed, that any system such as you and me that can maintain it's sustainable in a controllable environment, and by controllable I mean I can act on it and it makes a difference to what's going on out there, then that system must be a good model of the environment in which it is immersed. And if it is a good model, then it has to recapitulate the same architectural features that could be expressed mathematically in terms of recursions or expansions, or for example, the renormalization group you could induce here as an expression of a particular kind of scale-free emergence from recursive applications of the same Lagrangian or the same functional form for the updating or the movements or the dynamics. So if we are embedded in a world that has these scale-free aspects, which we probably are, then it must be the case that the brain and all the sense making and the Bayesian mechanics, for example, must itself also have this scale-free recursive hierarchical structure. And that just saying that allows you now to slip in open quotes, for example, at the kind of hierarchical depth that has emerged in deep learning that now is so popular in artificial intelligence research. So the very word deep just refers to the hierarchical depth of the implicit world models or generative models or good regulators that are now generating the right kind of content. There's no inactivism in modern, in most machine learning, but in active inference and in robotics and the like, there certainly is. So this is an early paper summarizing many of the some of these ideas from the point of view of neurobiology and how that hierarchical architecture could get installed into a brain just by regarding the brain as implementing Bayes' rule in the kind of way that would be sustainable in terms of engaging, fitting with, observing, making sense of, in an active way, a given environment. So interestingly, in this particular run through, which is trying to join the dots in a way that is similar to you, between different ways of looking at both the functional and computational architecture of the brain, and also a whole variety of schemes in statistics and machine learning, saying that they're all basically the same thing or special cases of each other. One interesting aspect of this work was not only do you have this hierarchical or recursive depth in terms of the the way that you articulated it in terms of recursively conditioning on further and further and further variables using Bayes' rule, in terms of cause-effect structures in a generative model of the lived world, but also in terms of time. So having a deep structure in terms of the state of the world is not just the state at the moment, it's the state of the world at the moment, how fast it's moving, the velocity, for example, in physics, how fast the fastness is moving, so the acceleration, for example, and so on to arbitrarily high orders of motion. So, or abstract temporal derivatives. So again, speaking to a recursion and the implicit depth, which you certainly see in neurobiology, and this paper's arguing you also see in the way that we actually analyze data as scientists and as statisticians. So that's why I put that paper up, which I thought you might find interesting. And that's just where I found it. Oh, let me go back to so I put this paper up right at the beginning because I was taken with one of your I can't quite remember the way that you phrased it, but certainly trying to find the duality between the mathematical implementation or the physical instantiation of Bayesian belief updating under Bayes' rule, and the narrative accounts that ensue from that in terms of the vernacular use of the word of beliefs and movement and understanding and perception and the like. And there was another reason I put this up, which was your treatment of proximity in probability spaces and the notion that at the end of the day, and certainly from the point of view of physics, the only movement that matters is through the space of probabilities. There is no other movement that is relevant from the perspective of physics, whether you're talking about quantum physics and probability amplitudes, right through to the classical Lagrangian mechanics that describes Euclidean, so Newtonian kinds of movement. It can all be expressed and indeed is written down or predicated on the density dynamics. So we're talking about the dynamics of the movement through a space of probabilities. The particular one which much of the literature I'm familiar with focuses on, the particular formulation, is in terms of information geometry. So do you know about information geometry?
I don't think so, no. Yeah.
I think you would enjoy reading about that and at least having a paragraph or two in your thesis chapter. So in brief, information geometry is the calculus that you would use to describe movements through spaces of probability distributions or densities. And put very simply, to use the words that you used, the space or the coordinates of that state space are the parameters of your Gibbs distributions. So let's assume that we had a Gaussian distribution. So the space that we're talking about now would have a mean and a variance. So it's a two-dimensional space. And that means that every point on that space stands in for a Gaussian distribution. And now you can generalize that again using your formulation to all the family of Gibbs distributions. So for any given Gibbs distribution, there will be a number of natural parameters or sufficient statistics. And that the number defines the dimensionality of your state space. And that in that state space, there is a geometry. And that geometry is afforded by the fact that, that at every point in this state space, there is an associated or specified probability distribution. And the geometry or the metric aspect of this space inherits from the closeness of the probability distributions in very much the way that you were intimating that is this particular probability distribution over ants versus not ants, given their continuous color. Is it an ant or not? How close is it? And I think you're using the example of small things, having gestures, making certain movements, and suddenly moving to another part of this information geometry or state space, where they were very tall things making the same kinds of movements. So along from some perspective, say the movement subspace or the probabilistic description of the movements, they were very, very close, but in terms of the tallness, they were a long way away. So the information geometry rests upon a state space whose dimensionality corresponds to the number of natural parameters or sufficient statistics of any given, say, Gibbs distribution. Movement in this space now corresponds to changing the probability distribution. So this is literally Bayesian belief updating. So when I make an act upon the world, when I move, I induce sensory feedback. That sensory feedback now causes a movement in this space, and this space is often referred to as a statistical manifold. So I now move on a statistical manifold in virtue of moving in a physical space, for example, or some attentional space. And that movement has a well-defined metric, and that's the Fisher information metric. It has many ways of being interpreted. If you're interested mathematically, it's also the path integral of infinitesimal KL divergences as you move along the path of least action from one belief to another belief, or one from the prior to the posterior, for example. So you can imagine, say, circadic eye movements every 250 milliseconds. New data comes in, I assimilate it, I update for my prior to my posterior, and I keep on doing that. So you can imagine this sort of saltatory path on the statistical manifold that has this information geometry that measures the amount I've changed my mind by measuring what's called the information distance or the information length between, which is the measure. It is a true metric, unlike the KL divergence, which is not a metric because it's not symmetric. The information length, which is a path integral of these infinitesimal KL changes as you move along the path of least action or least information distance between your prior and your posterior. That is the distance I think you were talking about. So if I was going to formalize what you were wanting in terms of the right kind of statistical measure of closeness that equipped any belief updating with this metric aspect, beautifully exemplified by, for example, Markov random fields, in terms of their sparse connectivity. I would frame this in terms of the information geometry, where the closeness is a well-defined information metric, information length, on a statistical manifold. And that's nice because now you can frame all physics and indeed all belief updating as a path on this statistical manifold that depends upon movement, because you need to get the new data to update your priors from your posteriors. So I put this paper up here because it just introduces the notion of information length heuristically from the point of view of philosophy of mind, where you've now got a calculus that allows you to talk about, to join the dots in possibly not quite in the interdisciplinary way that you were talking about, but I think could be used as an example of this. So now if I read my brain state activity, the activity of all my neural populations and the connectivity of the brain as standing in or just being the parameters of some Gibbs distribution, I've now got two information geometries that both inherit from the same physical instantiation. One of them is a probability that I will have this kind of activation pattern and this kind of connectivity. And this would be the kind of probability distribution that would underwrite the thermodynamics of my brain activity, the kind of thing that people like me use doing brain imaging, looking at brain activation in terms of thermodynamic work, in terms of oxygen consumption or fluctuations in voltages as recorded by the EEG. So that's one aspect of the movement of the in an information geometry, where that information geometry corresponds, or the coordinates are the parameters of my neuronal population activity. But there's another one which is much more interesting, well, equally interesting, and because my neural activity is now playing the role of a parameter of a Gibbs distribution, I've now got the information geometry appropriate to that Gibbs distribution, which is a belief about something else, about the outside. So it's not a probability distribution of the parameters, it's the probability distribution that is parameterized. So you've now got these two information geometries, one of which can be read as literally belief updating, conditional probability distribution updating, about things causing my sensory input. And the other one, the thermodynamic one, which is the thermodynamic updating or measures of the system that's doing the encoding or has beliefs about the outside. So that's where this Markovian monism gets into play. And it's just saying there are two information geometries that both rest upon exactly the same underlying dynamics. And that's one way, if you like, of joining the dots, that you can talk about brain activation and self-organization and all the biophysics of biotic self-organization or neurobiology, probabilistically on one hand, in terms of thermodynamics, but on the other hand, there is a dual aspect, a conjugate description in terms of updating beliefs that have a much more vernacular or colloquial interpretation in terms of subpersonal beliefs about what's going on out there. So that's from Cartesian duality to Markovian monism, just to make absolutely sure I've got that information geometry bit right. Yeah, so it's these equations you're looking for, equations 6 and 7, where it just introduces the notion of a statistical manifold and information geometry and this dual aspect. So I thought that might be interesting. I put this paper up by my colleague David Rudroff, simply because it really spoke to one of your points about having on the inside a model of the consequences of action that embodied the fact, or entailed the embodied way in which we look at things and that we move around things and we interact with things. So if the world actually has physical objects in it that conform to some kind of Lagrangian mechanics, and I'm looking at it from a certain perspective, then it must be the case that my model of what's going on, under which I'm doing my Bayesian belief updating, must also have this aspect to it. And that's been thoroughly explored from both a narrative / philosophical perspective, but also from a particular mathematical perspective by these authors here. So this one's a sort of mathematician. These two are mathematicians of consciousness, and their story rests upon this projective consciousness model, which basically is saying that there must be evidence to, I think use some of your words, that you should find in your brain anatomical and physiological evidence for a generative model entailed by the neuroanatomy and the neurophysiology that has this projective aspect, that I am a thing that's looking in this direction at these things in this space, and that, therefore, to make sense of my sensory samples, I actually have to work out the projective geometry that would ensue, given I'm taking this point of view and my eyes are here, and all sorts of interesting issues arise from that. So my favorite one from this body of work is where are you? If you had to point to where you are, where would you point to? Riddy, where would you point to?
Sorry, I wasn't listening. What were you saying?
Towards oneself, I suppose. I mean,
now, if I asked you to identify precisely to within 1 millimeter where the center of you is, where would you put that? Would you put it in your tummy?
Oh, where the center of me is here.
Yes.
Yeah. But then I know there's a cultural difference between some people saying here, some people saying nose, some people saying head. Yeah.
I didn't know that. I was taught that everybody points to 2 centimeters behind the center of the eyes. Which is
I think I would have gone with the chest as well, funnily enough.
Really? Well, that's probably more the heart than the brain.
Yeah, but I think that was the cultural aspect of it, where collectivistic cultures tend to point to the heart, and individualistic cultures tend to point to the head.
I should have phrased the question more specifically then. So you as a perceiving creature, as opposed to you as part of a community.
Then it would be the head. Yeah.
Anyway, I thought that one, just because, I repeat, there is a mathematical story to this, which really does foreground this projective geometry that would be required for active vision, for example, which I thought might be interesting for you. What's this one about? Okay, you were talking about phenomenology. Just a word of warning that phenomenology has a particular meaning in the neurosciences, and it's really about the qualitative experience of the sense making, not the sense making in and of itself. But interestingly, the most sophisticated treatments of that in my world, usually by this young author Lars Sandved-Smith, do appeal to this fundament that emerged a number of times in the talk, which was this notion of having a deep graphical model, having this recursive hierarchical graphical model, which he actually has a little diagram of here, literally in terms of a probabilistic graphical model that has this deep structure, where now you're allowed to talk about internal actions and mental actions as movements on the inside, and which would look a lot like attention in the in say psychology or cognitive neuroscience. If you were doing engineering, mathematical, they would look like change movements in terms of your estimates of the uncertainty, for example, changing the Kalman gain of a Bayesian filter. So I thought it was a nice point of connection there between phenomenology read as knowing that you are looking at something, even before knowing that it's you looking at something, but it's knowing you're looking at something, and this recursive aspect, applying the same principles again and again and again, but in this instance, movement not being physical movements of the body, but physical movements, biophysical movements in the brain that can be read as attentional gain or things like sensory attenuation. So that was that. This is the I don't know if you've read this, but this would probably one of the best summaries of the message passing entailed by Bayesian belief updating under deep graphical models that have this special attribute of being able to deal with categorical Gibbs distributions and Gaussian distributions. So you've got both these continuous RGB-like aspects to it, and the discrete ant versus not ant, object present versus absent, for example, aspect to it. And I think most people would argue along the lines that you were arguing, that our generative models in our brains have to have this sort of hybrid aspect, these different kinds of probability densities and distributions encoded by the sufficient statistics or parameters, and that neuronal dynamics just are the optimization under Bayes rule of the parameters of your posteriors to get the best explanation for the causes of your sensations. Interestingly, if you read it like that, that is mathematically equivalent to a gradient flow on that statistical manifold that we were talking about before for the information geometry. So if in this mathematical state space that has the information geometry, the statistical manifold is equipped with the Gibbs energy, which is usually a variational free energy at every point. And that means to do Bayesian belief updating, to be compliant with Bayes' rule, is basically with paths of least action in the most efficient way possible that has the minimum information distance to get to the closest plausible best explanation for the next observation. You can write that down as a gradient flow on the variation free energy, where the variation free energy is a function of where you are on this statistical manifold, and that is a description of neural dynamics. And you can write down what that would look like in terms of variational message passing or dynamics under models that have both this continuous and discrete aspect to them that are conjoined in a deep way hierarchically, but also factorizing over time. So that's why I'm putting that up there as an example of the biological plausibility of complying with Bayes' rule or minimizing dynamically your free energy on this statistical manifold under models that would have this mixed or hybrid aspect that combine both continuous and discrete probability distributions. And we just done that one, that's good. And yes, so finally, coming back to where you ended up and where I started, which is this sort of recursive aspect and the application, or how one would formalize that mathematically. Again, in my world, this would be most straightforwardly formulated as in terms of the renormalization group, where you've got the same Bayesian kinds of mechanics going on at each level of a recursive generative model, or that have this renormalizing aspect. So everything's the same as you condition upon higher and higher order variables. The rules are the same, the gradient flows on your free energy landscape or your free energy functional on the statistical manifold, your belief updating, they're all just recapitulated in a way that can be described by the renormalization group, and that leads to these renormalizing generative models that are becoming increasingly popular in machine learning, but also a nice description of hierarchical generative models in the brain, and have also been recently applied in this paper, which is under review, I think, somewhere, to this problem of where does objecthood emerge from retinal samples, two-dimensional sampling of the visual scene, and it just goes through some of the practical aspects of what belief updating, sense making, implementation of Bayes' rule would look like under one of these deep generative models that have this recursive or scale-free aspect that inherits from application of the or casting it in terms of the renormalization group. So I thought that was quite interesting. The might be interesting for you. The final point is one more of a cautionary point. I noticed at one point you were saying that in the absence of data, the Bayesian update is the identity mapping. So that would be like saying, from the point of view of movement on a statistical manifold, that you stand still. If there's no data, your priors are your priors, and you're just in the same place. So you've come to a halt in terms of movement or flow on your. There is a get out though, or there is another aspect when you go deep and when you go hierarchical, because you can still you can change the priors, you can change the manifold itself, or No, perhaps the manifold is the same, but you can change your prize in the absence of new data. And that's just an interesting twist. You can still maximize the marginal likelihood or the partition coefficient or the PZ that you were talking about before by changing your prize in the absence of data. And I mention this because that's both mathematical in terms of statistical analysis, an important observation when it comes to optimizing your models in the absence of new data, in terms of structure learning and Bayesian model selection, particularly Bayesian model reduction. But from your point of view, it's also quite interesting. It's the kind of thing we might do when we actually just close our eyes and think about things, or introspect, or more specifically, when we go to sleep. It may be that we can still do Bayesian updating without data. We can still move on the statistical manifold without any data, but not by changing our posteriors, but by changing the empirical prize, or the prize that emerge as soon as you have this hierarchical structure. So I should just qualify that. Empirical prize are the priors that live in a deep structure. So that, if you like, you call them sort of hierarchical likelihoods or hierarchical priors. They're empirical because they are still, in principle, updatable given some data, because they are they have prior constraints on them, so they can still move the empirical priors in a deep structure. But I thought it was important just to mention that, because then you can talk about introspection and sleep and mental action on the inside without any overt movement on the outside, but you can still optimize or do a kind of Bayesian belief updating through Bayesian model selection or reduction. And that's it. That's my brief tour of interesting papers, which I thought might be useful.
Yeah, thank you very much. Those all look very interesting in many different ways. I feel like it's always good to have more stuff to read.
Well, it depends whether you've already written your chapter thesis or not.
It's not that finished.
Huh?
It's not that finished, so.
Okay, good. That's ready.
Like, this is part of the process, so thank you. Yeah, that's a lot of things to go through. I have to now think about this idea of an automorphism as also like possibly. I was thinking about it in terms of symmetry, and being like, there is a transformation, but the transformation like is imperceivable in some way. But I think in this instance, it would be a perceivable transformation on a statistical space. So in terms of the Bayesian updating through the changing of empirical priors. But yeah, all of these papers look very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Carl, for providing the feedback as well. Let's just have one final round of applause for you and for everybody else for the discussion. So thank you so much. Yes. Well, let's do it. Thank you. So as Carl had said, I will be uploading this on YouTube as a private link first. So I'll send that to you. And then when it's publicly available, then you'll be able to see it on the website. But I'll send it to you first, so then you can look through the papers that he mentioned in the comments and from everybody else as well, and take that in. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.